As 1 Samuel chapter 17 begins, the Israelites were at war. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle in verse 1. Now the pagan Philistines were a constant thorn in the side of the children of Israel. In verse 1 to 3, King Saul and his army, they line up on one mountain while the Philistines gathered on a mountain opposite of them. And between there's a valley called Elam in the northwest Judah. Each morning, each army put on their armor and they gave this great war cry. The two forces, they hurled insults back and forth, but neither made the first move to attack. Finally, from among the Philistines came this giant, a massive, towering presence. Verse 4, Goliath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. That's approximately 9.5 feet tall. Now, assuming Goliath was proportioned as most men, he would weigh between 600 and 700 pounds. He was 600 plus pounds of mighty muscle, not fleshly fat. He carried armor and weapons that probably exceeded 200 pounds in weight. That'd be verse 5 through 7. Goliath had been a soldier from his youth. He was a battle-hardened, killing machine. For 40 mornings and evenings, or 80 times, Goliath, he took his stand and he shouted at the ranks of the Israelites to send forth one soldier to fight him. And the army of the loser became the servants of the one that was victorious. Verse 11, when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. It would have been very scary to face in single battle a giant over 9 feet tall. But we all have giants around us, things that loom very large in our lives that we must face. Problems we must conquer if we are to go on successfully with our daily existence. If you have not yet had a giant to face in your life, I assure you that at some point in time you will. All of us have our giants, challenges that emerge huge on our horizon. Confrontation that make our knees grow weak. So the question this morning is, how do we defeat the Goliaths in our life? Well, in 1 Samuel 17, we find 7 truths to recall about fighting giants. These realities will help us to be victorious. Our first truth is that giants appear when you least expect it. This is in verse 15 or 12 to 15 and then 17 to 23. While David's 3 older brothers were in the army of Israel, David, the baby of the family, he stayed home in Bethlehem and did the chores. Now, scholars think that he was still in his teens, under the age of 20. Most of his time, day to day, was to care for the sheep as a shepherd in the fields. But occasionally, he went to Saul's palace to play the harp for the king. Now, David's father, Jesse, told David to take provisions to these 3 brothers who were in the camp of Israel, located in the valley of Elah, as Bethlehem was about 20 miles away, or about a 6-hour walk. Now, as David headed to the valley, I'm sure that the very last thing on his mind was about fighting a real giant. That morning, as dawn came up, it was just like any other. No doubt David was excited about seeing his 3 older brothers and maybe get to witness an actual battle. But there was no thought of meeting a giant. Brethren, the day will appear in your life just like any other day, and that's when the giants will come. You wake up and you start out with your normal daily routine. Then an email comes, a phone call, a text, or someone stops by, and then suddenly there looms the giant. When David reached the valley, he gave the provisions to who was in charge, and then he went to see his brothers and how they were doing in King Saul's army. Now in chapter 17, look at verse 23. And as he was talking with them, the champion named Goliath was coming up, and he spoke these words, and David heard them. Now these same words would be what was spoken earlier in verse 10. Imagine the sarcasm in Goliath's voice. I have been standing on this spot now for 40 days. I have made the challenge again and again. Is no one in all Israel brave enough to face me? So David, he heard Goliath speak. David could not ignore the fact that a giant had come into his life. Brethren, mark it down. Sooner or later, you are going to have to face your giant. The second truth is you can face the giant with fear or with faith. And this is in verse 24 to 27. Our text contrasts the fear of Saul's soldiers and the faith of David. Verse 24. When all the men of Israel saw the man, they fled from him and were greatly afraid. Now, as David is talking to his brothers, Goliath came out and he hurled his challenge. David says, you hear what that Philistine said? No one answered. David, he looks around and he's standing there all alone. Everyone else is like a banana and split. They leave him behind in a place where they are in nearby safety. David goes to where the soldiers are shaking in their sandals, and they're talking about the situation. Now, since no one volunteered to fight the giant, Saul had sweetened the pot. Verse 25, the last part. The king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. Now Saul was not trying to get rid of an ugly offspring, but this was a tempting incentive. If one married the king's daughter, he became part of the royal family with prestige, position, and power. Now, father's house free means to be exempt from taxes and public provision, like having to perform military service. Well, let me raise a question. Of all the troops on the Israelite side, who would have been the most logical choice to fight the giant? Saul himself. Because in 1 Samuel 10:23, when he stood among the people, he was taller than any of the people from shoulders upward. Saul was nearest to the giant's size, being head and shoulder over everyone else there. But he was greatly afraid in verse 11. So he dangled these enticements before his men. These attractive offers meant nothing to David. He was so upset because the name of his God was blasphemed. David is not interested in the rewards. Rather, he was concerned about the honor of God. Listen to David in verse 26, the last part. For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should taunt the armies of the living God? All of us need a heart of David. We hear the name of God, even his word, being blasphemed from day to day, and we just get used to it. We become hardened and think nothing of that of which is holy being profane. But David, he got angry. These spiritual fools were insulting the true living God. He's so upset, he says, why does not somebody, one of you who's more mature and older fellows, do something about it? Brethren, as giants come into our lives, we can be afraid, or we can meet them head on with the faith that we have in God. We can be overwhelmed by them, or we can see them as an opportunity to glorify the name of God. Our third truth is that someone will always be ready to discourage you. That's verse 28 to 33. You would think that when problems come in a person's life, that everyone around would be supportive and strengthening, but that's not always necessarily so. Instead, there will always be somebody ready to say, you cannot do this. You don't have what it takes. You might just as well give up, throw in the towel, raise the white flag of surrender. When it came to fighting David's giant, no one seemed to be sympathetic to the situation. David's father, Jesse, sent the 3 oldest boys to join the army. Now David, as he was too young. Eliab, the firstborn of Jesse, told his baby brother David that he was rude and wicked in the heart, verse 28. Now remember back in chapter 16, when Samuel went to Jesse's household in Bethlehem to anoint a new king for Israel. Eliab was the first son Samuel saw, and he thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before me. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at the statue or the height of his stature, for man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart, verse 6 and 7. Then Eliab had to stand by and watch the horn of oil be poured on the head of the runt in the litter. Jealousy was eating up this brother, so he insults David's motives, David's job, and David's heart. Verse 28, Eliab's anger burns against David. Now the natural response of David would have been to get into a fist fight and hopefully bloody his older brother's nose. Now, do you have any brothers or sisters? Did you ever get into a fuss with them? If David had been like us, he would probably have gone rounds with his brother. That is the way so often when we face giants. Instead of using our energy to fight the giants, we fight people. We are unhappy, so we take it out on those around us, using the strength that should be spent in defeating our giants. David refused to be drawn into a prolonged battle with his brother. He was not going to fight in the camp when there was a giant in the valley below. We need to learn this in the New Testament church. We sometimes fight among ourselves when there are giants of ungodly evil in religion and politics that we need to have our complete energy fighting against outside our walls. David's inquiries came to the ear of Saul, and he sent for David. Verse 32, and David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. Now, King Saul tried to discourage David in verse 33. How could you possibly know anything about warfare? You're just a youngster who takes care of sheep. And this giant has been trained for this moment since he was a boy. No, David, you are just too inexperienced. This chapter 17 illustrates the truth of chapter 16, verse 7. The Lord looks at the heart. Everyone tried to discourage this young man, one way or another, from fighting Goliath. A little time later, the giant joined in verse 43 and 44. And the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine also said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field." The giant saying, "You're just too small. You're just too weak. You're just too ill-equipped, you silly boy." Brethren, when you face your giant, you are going to hear discouraging words. They may come from your very family, as in Jesse and his brother, or from friends, as David had already been playing the harp to remove the evil spirit from Saul, so Saul had become a friend. Or from someone that doesn't even like you, a Goliath. You can count on it. Disheartening words will come, penetrating your ears with negativism. Prepare your mind for them, and do not be surprised when folks say, "You cannot do it." Our fourth truth is that you must prepare before you meet your giants. This is in verse 34 to 37. If you take the approach, "Well, I'll wait until the problem arises, then I will face it," you will most likely end up like Goliath, flat on your face with a major headache. You must prepare before you meet any giant. David had prepared himself to face Goliath first by facing lions and bears as he took care of the sheep. When Saul tried to discourage David, the young shepherd answers in verse 34 to 36. "Your servant was tending his father's sheep when a lion or a bear came and took the lamb from the flock. I went out after him and attacked him and rescued it from his mouth. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God." David did not prepare for Goliath on the battlefield, but in a perilous pasture. David did not have to face the lion and the bear. He could have run away. No one would have known but the sheep, and they were not talking. David did not get hazardous duty pay for facing these fierce man-eating creatures. Nor did he get a thank you card from the sheep, or was he called hero of the day back in Bethlehem. Facing lions and bears was part of the work description of a shepherd, and David did his job well. Your preparation to meet life must come from within. You prepare for the big giants in your life by first facing the little giants. You prepare for the major problems not by ignoring the little problems of your life, but by attacking them squarely and dealing with them through the help of God. David's most important preparation for meeting Goliath was cultivated in his relationship with God. As David spoke of killing the lion and the bear, note to whom he gives the credit in verse 37. "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." David actively believed in and followed the God of Moses. In 1 John chapter 5, verse 4, "And this is the victory that overcomes the world, our faith." Well, how did this teenager develop a faith in God that the men in Saul's army did not have? The same way that each of us in the New Testament church increase our faith. David meditated on God and God's word. So faith comes from hearing, and hearing by the word of God. Romans 10:17. As well as the victories that God had given him in protecting the flock. Our problem is that we recall what we should forget, and we forget what we should remember. We reflect on our failures, and we fail to recall the victories that God has given us. Brethren, instead of dwelling on past defeats, we must dwell on how God has continually helped us to deal with our issues, so that we can be ready when these giants walk uninvited into our lives. Our fifth truth follows the fourth. Prepare the very best that you can, and then depend on God. This is verse 37 to 47. Now Saul must have been desperate. I cannot think of any other reason why he would entrust the task of killing a giant to a youngster. In the last part of verse 37, and Saul said to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." It is ironic that the king knew the language of faith, but did not have a life of faith. If Saul had really believed that the Lord would be with David and give the boy the victory, Saul would have been all armored up and on the battlefield himself. We cannot help but be impressed with the confidence of David, in contrast to the lack of confidence in those who were around him. David had self-assurance because of at least three things, beginning with the letter T. First, he was certain because of his training. This is suggested in verse 38 and 39. Now, sort of humorous scene here as Saul put his armor on David. Now, I don't know why, unless maybe Saul was hoping to take a little part of the credit. It'd be like someone saying, "Yeah, he shot the rhinoceros, but with my gun." David put on all this metal, and verse 39, he tried to walk. He couldn't even walk, much less be able to fight. Verse 39 continues, "I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them." And David took them off. David says, "I'm going to stay with what I know." David had confidence in what he knew he could do, and that which stood the test for him in the past. And what was that? He knew that he could whirl a sling and throw a rock in the sling. He had confidence in his training. Our second T, David also had sureness because of his tools, the sling and the stones. All of us boys who were growing up in the early 60s, we had a device called a slingshot. But that is not what David used here. David's sling had a leather pouch with a long leather thong tied to each side of the pouch. To use a sling, you put a stone in the pouch, then you hold the ends of the thongs in your hand on the tube, and then you start to sling this thing around. As you're slinging it around, you're getting up all the speed. Then you turn loose of one of the thongs, and then that stone will strike the desired object. David had crafted this type of skill. He goes to a nearby water brook, and he picked up 5 smooth stones. These objects were worn round by the tumbling action of the water so that it could be thrown with greater accuracy. And now he is ready for his giant, verse 40. He approached the Philistine. Now as David stepped forward with composure, it was not simply because of his training and tools. He was primarily confident because of his third T, his trust. David depended on his God. In verse 40 and 41, there's a sharp contrast between these two fighters. From one direction, you have a small, rosy-cheeked young man in a robe and sandals with 5 smooth stones and a sling. From the other direction, a huge, towering man, fully armored with weaponry, and even had another fella being his shield bearer. The giant, he saw this puny boy, and he insults him in verse 42 and 43. Now, when Goliath cursed David by his gods, Dagon, Baal, and the rest, he made a major mistake. He turned a military encounter into a theological contest. It was going to be God versus the gods with a little g. That's what happens here. Goliath, he attempts to intimidate David. Verse 44, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field. We get intimidated by the challenges confronting us, don't we? Often, we could face our giants if we could just get our teeth to stop chattering. If a 9.5-foot monster said he was going to feed my carcass to the buzzards, I would be petrified. Instead of Goliath's threat terrifying David, we have a great expression of faith, starting at verse 45. You come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day by the Lord will deliver you up into my hands, and I will strike you down, and I will remove your head from you, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by the sword or by spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will put or give you into our hands. The battle is the Lord's. If you have not underlined that passage, you need to do that. Back when I was attending Harding Preaching School, I underlined that little section. David lived by a simple principle. He was not trying to impress anyone. He was just standing up for God. He desired that all the people to know that there is a true and living God in heaven, and that the victory belongs to him. Without armor and weapons of war, God defended his name through David against Satan's champion. I suggest to you that we need to prepare for the challenges that life can bring. At some point in your life, you will be turning around a corner and you're going to encounter a giant so massive that all of your training will seem lacking, that all of your tools are inadequate. Then it is important to remember that the battle is the Lord's. In the end, the way to live the confident life is to trust in God. Our sixth truth is that if you have a giant, face it at once. Do not hesitate. That's verse 48 to 51. David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet the Philistine, put his hand into his bag, and took from it a stone and slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. And the stone sank into his forehead, so that he fell on his face to the ground. That's verse 48 and 49. David's confrontation was not finished. The giant might only be stunned or just knocked unconscious. Again, David moved quickly. Verse 51. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine, and took his, that's Goliath's sword, and drew it out of his sleeve, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. This dramatic victory teaches us that ultimately victory is not dependent upon size or physical skill and strength, but on our relationship with God. Let us never forget that fact. The victory also teaches that when you have a giant to fight, do not put it off. Every day you postpone facing a challenge, that giant is going to grow another foot in height. Every day that passes, it will become harder and harder to solve your problem. Brethren, face your giants with God's help, and face them at once. And speaking of victories, lastly, one victory prepares for the other. This is verse 51 to 54. Throughout David's life, one victory prepared him for the next. His victory of lions and bears prepared him for this moment against a vicious human animal. Now this victory was preparing him for other victories in life. First, David's courageous victory helped the Israelite army to grow a strong spine in several seconds. After David separated the head from the body, I can imagine him looking up at the Philistine army standing there. Their eyes are bug open and their mouths are open wide. And David shouts, "Are there any more giants among you heathens? I still have 4 more stones." Look at the last part of verse 51. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Then the Israelites, who had been so fearful, they come streaming down the mountainside screaming, "Give me a giant. I want one too." Verse 52, the first part. And the men of Israel and Judah arose and they shouted and they pursued the Philistines. David's example of facing his giant encouraged faith in the Israelites to chase their giants. No doubt, David's victory also encouraged David himself. Look at verse 54. Then David took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his weapons in his tent. Some hunters, they collect deer, elk, moose. Big-time hunters, they bag lions, tigers, and bears. Oh my. Now David's trophy was a human head. Now no doubt his mother said, "You're not going to be hanging that nasty thing on my living room wall." So Goliath's head just rolls on down to Jerusalem. But Goliath's weapons are in David's tent, which tells us that when David laid down every night, he could look over at those items and say, "God gave me the victory. The battle is the Lord's." Every morning when he woke up, he could see them and he could say, "God gave me the victory. The battle is the Lord's." Morning and night, day in and day out, David was reminded that if you stay with God, you have the victory. Brethren, every time God gives you a victory, engrave the details of that wondrous event upon your heart. God does not want us to waste a single victory. God says, do not forget it. Nothing will give you more strength in the future battles than to know that all the victories are the Lord's. Fighting giants can be a lonely business. When David stepped into the field of battle, he was all alone except for his God. Also remember, brethren, that God and you make up the majority in any given situation. To face giants, you need God above all else. And this begins by becoming a New Testament Christian this morning. Through belief, through repentance, as well as water immersion for the forgiveness of your sins, begins to have you putting on that road of faith as a New Testament Christian. Then just remain faithful unto the end and continually fight your giants as the Lord would want you, because that's for his victories. So if you need to respond in a public way, come right now as together we stand.